Israel just told its 7 million citizens, something no government ever wants to admit: we can't protect you anymore. As that admission hit the wire, global markets priced in the failure instantly. Brent crude surged as much as 13%. West Texas Intermediate posted its biggest weekly surge since 1985. This wasn't just a message, it was a formal admission of total system failure. The state's multi-billion-dollar shield, its core promise of security, was broken. This was the first signal of a crisis that was no longer regional, but global. But this outcome was not an accident. And to understand the risk and protect our own positioning, we must dissect precisely how it was engineered. Because what the world just witnessed wasn't chaos. It was the successful execution of a meticulously designed kill chain. And we are about to analyze every single link. This defensive collapse wasn't an accident. It was the calculated outcome of a deliberate two-phase strategy. Iran didn't just fight the system, they systematically disassembled it, piece by piece, because they understood its architecture and its vulnerabilities. Phase 1 was to blind the network. An integrated air defense shield is only as good as its eyes, its long-range radar systems. So, that's what Iran went for first. We're not talking about minor assets. Satellite imagery and US officials confirmed the strikes methodically, took out two of the most critical installations in the entire region. The $300 million AEN TPY-2 radar at Jordan's Muwafaq Salti Air Base and the $1.1 billion AN FPS 132 early warning radar at Qatar's Al Udeid Air Base. With those eyes destroyed, the defense shield was now partially blind. Then came Phase 2, exhausting the fists. With the network's vision impaired, Iran launched saturation attacks. The goal here wasn't necessarily to land every single missile. The strategic objective was to force the defense system to fire its interceptors. A finite, expensive resource. It's a simple calculation. You overwhelm the system with more incoming threats than it has bullets to shoot down. And it worked. The operational consequence of this successful two-stage deconstruction was catastrophic. The early warning time for incoming threats, the critical window to react, take cover, and launch countermeasures, collapsed. It went from a manageable 15 to 25 minutes down to just 60 to 90 seconds. That's not a defense system, that's a countdown clock. When a clock is counting down, something inevitably reaches zero. The first alarm to sound in this crisis wasn't in Washington or Tel Aviv, it was in the small Gulf state of Bahrain, inside a political pressure cooker likely with encouragement from its Western allies. Bahrain makes a fateful decision. For the first time, from its own sovereign territory, it launches direct missile and drone strikes against Iran. And with that single act, a decades-old unspoken rule that had contained regional conflicts was shattered. The rule of plausible deniability. That crucial buffer, which allowed nations to act through proxies without triggering all-out war, was gone. This was a strategic miscalculation of staggering proportions. In the cold language of strategy, Bahrain didn't just support an ally. It volunteered to become the next target on the map. The proxy war was over. A direct, state-on-state war had just begun. The consequences for placing yourself directly in Iran's crosshairs were not theoretical. They were immediate. What Bahrain received in return was not a proportional response. It was the unleashing of a pre-planned, overwhelming, and devastatingly precise counteroffensive that would throw the entire nation into chaos. Was not a proportional response. It was the unleashing of a pre-planned, overwhelming, and devastatingly precise counteroffensive that would throw the entire nation into chaos. But the target wasn't just Bahrain. In that single night, The retribution cascaded across the entire region, hitting 5 nations almost simultaneously. This was not a chaotic, emotional lashing out. It was a clinical, synchronized demonstration of sophisticated, theater-wide command and control. On the strategic map, the vectors of attack radiated out from Iran like a torrent, hitting US assets in Iraq, fuel storage facilities in Qatar, critical infrastructure in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and targets in Israel. The message was unambiguous. Iran was prepared for this exact scenario. Imagine the scene. In the financial districts of Dubai and Doha, the workday had just ended. The skyline was a testament to a future of commerce and security. Then the alerts began to flash across millions of smartphones, their unified chime cutting through the evening air. It wasn't a distant news report, it was a direct personal warning. From the glass walls of those gleaming towers you could see them. Fiery streaks ascending into the night sky, met by the desperate flashes of interceptors. The city that hosted the World Cup was now under lockdown. Smoke was seen rising from the US-run Naval Support Activity base in Bahrain. The illusion of detached security, the belief that these economic hubs were insulated from the region's conflicts, evaporated in a matter of minutes. The war had come to the heart of global commerce. We've just seen how a coordinated strike can paralyze multiple economic hubs in a single night. For the experienced investors watching, what second-order effect do you believe the market is currently underpricing the most? Share your sharpest insights in the comments below. This single night of fire fundamentally altered the strategic reality. The sheer scale was staggering. Bahrain alone confirmed it had engaged 86 missiles and 148 drones since the conflict began. Iran had proven it possessed not just the weapons, but the command structure to project overwhelming force across the entire theater at will. With the board state so violently reset, all eyes turned to Washington. But the response that came was not one of strategic reassessment. It was a page torn from an old, and perhaps now obsolete playbook. And that old play was a familiar one, a show of overwhelming conventional force. As the crisis spiraled, the White House announced that a third US aircraft carrier battle group, the USS George H.W. Bush, was being deployed to the region to join the Lincoln and the Ford. In a public address, President Trump framed the move in the classic language of power politics. This, he declared, was about adding leverage to force Iran to capitulate. But this is where the dangerous gap between rhetoric and reality becomes a chasm. Let's perform a brutal translation of what sending leverage actually means in this new theater. It means placing a 97,000-ton, multi-billion-dollar sovereign asset with nearly 5,000 American lives aboard directly into a pre-sighted kill box. Because from Tehran's perspective, that carrier group is not leverage. It is a target. A very large, very high value, and, critically, a very vulnerable target. The logic of deterrence that worked for 50 years assumes a symmetry that no longer exists. The United States brought a symbol of 20th century power to a 21st century fight defined by asymmetric capabilities. Iran's possession of advanced, maneuverable, hypersonic anti-ship missiles completely changes the physics of naval warfare in the Gulf. An asset designed for power projection becomes a liability. The American action was not a de-escalation. It was a colossal gamble based on an almost delusional faith in an outdated model of power. As one analyst put it at the time, Trump is calling this leverage. Iran is calling it a target. History will decide which one is right, but the physics already have an opinion. But the gap between perception and physics in the Gulf wasn't the only disconnect. found an even more dangerous miscalculation was dominating the narrative war. All through the escalating conflict, a chorus of confident voices on cable news and pronouncements from Western leaders, including President Trump, insisted on one core belief: Iran is breaking. The regime was fragile, they claimed, on the verge of implosion. Then, on February 28, 2026, that theory was put to the ultimate test. In a series of strikes, the supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, was assassinated. This was the moment the regime was supposed to shatter. Instead, the opposite happened. While the West watched for chaos, Iran's assembly of experts convened. Quietly, methodically, constitutionally. Within what sources described as 1 or 2 days, a new supreme leader was elected. This wasn't a desperate scramble for power. This was a broadcast signal to Washington and the world. The message was unambiguous: you cannot decapitate us. The system is stronger than any individual. The state apparatus is stable. Prepare for a long war. The fantasy of a crumbling regime evaporated against the hard reality of a seamless institutional succession. In its place stood a newly unified command structure, now ready for either further military escalation or, for the first time, truly credible negotiations from a position of proven strength. With the core assumption of a collapsing Iranian regime now invalidated, the strategic calculus for the Western alliance inverted. The focus shifted from exploiting perceived weakness to a desperate need for a show of unity, and the first call for loyalty was made to the United Kingdom. In response, London dispatched what it could. The aircraft carrier HMS Prince of Wales was prepared for deployment. Additional Typhoon fighter jets were sent to the region, and British bases like RAF Fairford were opened for American B-1 bombers conducting operations. But let us be precise about what this was. This was not a sound military strategy. It was a political act of fealty. A post-Brexit Britain demonstrating its continued relevance in the special relationship by sending vulnerable assets into a high-threat environment. This decision to risk strategic assets based on political convenience and a willful underestimation of an adversary's resolve follows a deeply dangerous historical pattern. It is a direct echo of the 1930s. Then, Winston Churchill was a voice in the wilderness, warning of Germany's rearmament, while Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain pursued appeasement. Chamberlain returned from Munich in 1938, declaring peace for our time. Churchill's verdict was more accurate: a total and unmitigated defeat. War began less than a year later. Churchill famously defined this logic. An appeaser, he said, as one who feeds a crocodile, hoping it will eat him last. In this crisis, the United Kingdom's deployment was the offering being fed to the crocodile. But this historical miscalculation isn't just an academic parallel, It carries an immediate and devastating economic price. Because while politicians make gestures, the real cost is about to be calculated not in speeches, but in the tanker traffic passing through the world's most critical energy choke point, the Strait of Hormuz. And now, that bill has come due. The geopolitical conflict translates into a direct, unavoidable cost as Iran makes good on its threat. The Strait of Hormuz, the choke point for 20% of global oil, grinds to a halt. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a hard shutdown of a critical economic artery. What satellite imagery once showed as a bustling artery of global commerce, teeming with tankers, is now an empty sea. The once constant flow of energy has simply stopped. Pause. The oil price surge is what the media will fixate on. It is also the least important part of this equation. The real danger is not the number on your screen today.
It's a new permanent risk being priced into the global system that will quietly corrode positioned wealth for the foreseeable future. Here is how. The immediate effect is a vertical shock across market screens. Analysts' worst-case scenarios for Brent crude, ranging from $85 to $130 a barrel, become the new reality. Supertanker freight rates for the critical Middle East to Asia route is more than double, hitting record highs. Lloyd's of London, the foundation of maritime insurance, cancels war risk coverage for the area, effectively making the world's most important energy corridor uninsurable. For import-dependent economies like Japan and South Korea, this triggers an immediate energy and supply chain crisis. But beyond the initial spike is the far more damaging second-order effect. This sustained threat imposes a new structural risk premium on global energy. Let's translate regional instability into what it actually is. A new permanent tax on the entire global economy, paid for by everyone at the gas pump and the grocery store. This guarantees prolonged volatility and inflation that ripples through every supply chain, eroding margins and pressuring portfolios long after the initial shock fades. The world didn't vote for this war. The world is paying for it anyway. We have seen a failure of military deterrence, a failure of political alliances, and now a failure of the economic system to insulate itself from the consequences. With every conventional lever of power broken, it forces a final, critical question. What is the fundamental flaw in the Western strategic model itself that we've all been conditioned to ignore? The answer to that defines the next decade. The fundamental flaw in the Western strategic model, the one we've been conditioned to ignore, is this. It wasn't a strategy at all. It was an assumption. And that leads to the stark, unavoidable conclusion of this entire chain of events. There is no clear path to victory, because the war itself was based on a false premise. The core miscalculation was a dangerous underestimation of Iran's capability and strategic resolve. That broken shield we saw, the failure of the early warning network, was not an isolated technical glitch. It was the first critical signal of a fatal gap between optimistic political rhetoric and the harsh reality on the ground. This gap allowed a false narrative to take hold, the idea that Iran would simply surrender under pressure. This was more than a misjudgment. It was a strategic deception, masking the true intentions of resource control and obscuring the West's increasingly precarious position. That vulnerable aircraft carrier wasn't just a military asset at risk, it was a symbol of an entire power structure trapped by its own flawed logic. Let's state this in the bluntest terms possible. The West didn't have a plan. It had an assumption, and when that assumption broke, the entire global economy began to pay the price. This brings us to the ultimate thesis for any strategist or investor. The very presence of foreign military forces in the region is no longer the solution to instability. It has become its primary cause. This conflict is not an anomaly. It is the symptom of a failed decades-long policy reaching its inevitable conclusion. The ability to see this causal chain, to separate official narratives from market reality, is the critical edge. For more clear-eyed analysis that connects the dots between geopolitics and your portfolio, subscribe now. It is the essential tool to protect your positioning in a world where the old assumptions no longer hold.